And there, too, the ante raised, as Meir Javedanfar was saying. Let's just listen for a moment to the Republican frontrunner.
Probably the greatest threat we face in the globe is a nuclear Iran. And he said he was going to engage Iran. Remember, and visit with Ahmadinejad in his first year? Didn't quite work out like he hoped. Iran pursuing their nuclear ambition, announced yesterday. They've now developed a nuclear rod. They tested a medium-range surface-to-air missile. Iran continues to be and is actually a greater threat than when he became president.
Mohammed Sahimi, I know that for TehranBureau.com you've penned a piece on basically comparing what the different Republican candidates have to say about Iran. Can you explain for our viewers why the rhetoric is going crescendo where you are?
Well, one reason for it is that the Republican candidates think that President Obama has successful in terms of his foreign policy, except for Iran. And of course, bringing Iran is everything to the support for Israel. And the GOP candidates are trying to attract the Jewish vote in the United States by claiming that President Obama hasn't been popular.
Mohammed, I'm going to have to cut you off because we're having technical issues. You're fading in and out, but we will get back to you in a moment. Rouzbeh, PARSI, we've seen. Explain to us from your view, why do you think that in the U.S. the tone is rising so rapidly there?
Well, basically, you can say when it comes to Iran, there is no candidate for any kind of elected office that has lost anything by being harsh on Iran. And what you have here is, in a sense, the perfect storm. Because on the one hand, the Democrats, because they usually are very pro-Israeli, they take the Israeli line on how dangerous Iran is. And the Republicans are trying to win exactly the same vote. And so they also want to show Obama being weak in general when it comes to foreign policy. So this kind of barely regional power, Iran, is now become a global threat, according to these candidates, almost a par with Soviet Union, which is, of course, quite absurd.
And we see on this one that Washington's friends extend beyond Israel. The French foreign minister spoke out this Tuesday. Let's take a listen.
Iran is still developing nuclear weapons. I think there's no doubt about that. The International Atomic Energy Agency's report is quite explicit, and that's why France, without foreclosing negotiation and dialogue with Iran, of course, wants stricter sanctions.
All right, you note the distinction there. He says we're not closing the door to negotiations, but the French, very hard line as well.
You know, it's funny. This panel is giving me a funny feeling. You guys are talking just like Iran is the aggrieved party. Here we have a nation which has enslaved its own people for over 30 years. When people vote, they steal their votes. They threaten all their neighbors. They are refusing to cooperate with any arrangement for international things, and you guys are sounding like they are really the poor guys that the U.S. and everybody else is ganging on them. That's not the case. The question is this government has no legitimacy, and therefore having a foreign enemy is the only way they can stay in power. They are going to continue making agitations because that's the only way that they try to get people's attention away from their domestic problems. Look at what is happening to the country. Inflation is over 30%. Unemployment is close to 20%. The country's money has lost its total value. Again, this is their own fault because before they were keeping the price of dollar down artificially in order to fight inflation and to make imports cheaper. As a result, they killed the export of the country, and cheap imports from China closed all the factories and people are unemployed. I mean, we are talking about a monster in that part of the world. We are not talking about legitimate government. We are not talking about people who understand international norms of behavior. They go and kill people in other countries. They send terrorists all the way to Argentina. I mean, let's make some sense. I mean, the world cannot go on tolerating something like this forever. I'm sure sooner or later something will happen.
What do you mean by something will happen?
Well, most probably, if they continue this, it just takes one mistake, and we'll be facing another war. And I think that's what they want. That's exactly what they're asking for.
I am afraid I don't really recognize myself in that description, if nothing else, because the issue that we're discussing is not whether there is a celestial kind of government in Iran. The issue is whether or not there is an international situation where they're part of a game that could lead to a deadly conflict with other countries. And obviously no one here in the sense of the actors involved, is totally without guilt. Now, we can discuss how much of the guilt should be on either side, but the issue wasn't whether Iran is run by a perfect government. The issue is whether this kind of dynamic is getting us anywhere. If you allow me just for a moment, we have now sanctions. We've had sanctions for a number of years. Now, they've had an effect on the Iranian economy. They've had an effect on Iran. But they have not been effective in terms of what they were put in place for, which is the nuclear issue. We only recently have started having sanctions because of the human rights record of Iran. But in general, these sanctions based on international law have to do with Iran's obligations to the NPT treaty and nothing else.
Just before we go to the break, Meir Javedanfar.
I have to respectfully disagree with my colleague Rouzbeh, PARSI. I think one of the reasons why Iran has not had a nuclear weapon is because of the sanctions, Rouzbeh. It's because the Iranian government is finding it so difficult to get the parts for its nuclear program. And if you want to know if the Iranian government wants to build a bomb or not, I refer you to the recent IAEA report. And I think this is not a situation where we are trying to see who is better or not. We are dealing with a government that is threatening its own neighbors, and we just want to make sure that when it comes to handling this government, we are not going to be the only losers. Because believe you me, when it comes to Iran being a danger to Israel, Rouzbeh, I don't have to listen to Prime Minister Netanyahu. I walked down Dizengoff Street, 3 buses blew up on that street with Iranian money and Hamas operatives. This is not some fantasy we're talking about. It's a real danger to the citizens of Israel, and we just want to make sure that a peaceful solution is found that spares us from war. This is not something that is to be taken lightly.
All right, and when we come back with the France 24 debate, we're going to look a little bit more closely at how those sanctions are impacting Iranians. You're watching the France 24 debate. Stay with us.